At our college alumni gala, my ex-husband cornered me with a smug grin, mocking my modest dress and calling my 6-year-old son tragic baggage. He bragged about his upcoming tech initial public offering, completely unaware that the towering man who just walked up to kiss my cheek was the exact billionaire liquidator holding the massive debt about to destroy his entire company. My name is Cassidy, and at 30 years old, my life is built on uncovering the ugly truths hidden inside corporate balance sheets. As a forensic accountant, I hunt down fraud for a living. The biggest fraud I ever encountered was Preston, the man I married right after graduation. Tonight was our university alumni gala. I stood near the edge of the grand ballroom sipping sparkling water. I was waiting for my husband and my son to return from the coat check when a painfully familiar voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Well, if it isn't Cassidy," Preston drawled, stepping into my line of sight. He wore a flashy custom suit that screamed newly minted tech money. "I am surprised they let you in wearing a dress off a discount rack. Are you still scraping by with that sad bookkeeping hustle?" I kept my expression neutral. I spent the first 4 years of our marriage working 60-hour weeks to pay our rent and fund his endless startup pitches. But the moment I discovered I was pregnant at 24, his mask slipped. He told me a child would ruin his trajectory and demanded I get rid of it. When I refused, he drained our joint savings through a shady legal loophole and left me completely destitute. My status-obsessed parents took his side, calling me a fool for ruining a good marriage over a baby. I survived that betrayal. I built a highly successful forensic accounting firm from my kitchen table. Now my agency handles complex fraud investigations for major corporations, though I purposefully keep my wealth private. Preston, meanwhile, managed to secure a chief executive position at a trending fintech startup, fueled entirely by his arrogance and blind venture capital. He stood in front of me now. "You look exhausted, Cassidy," he mocked. "I heard you kept the kid. That is truly tragic. You really ruined your potential. Look at me now. I am the chief executive officer of a revolutionary tech firm about to go public. And you are a failed single mother who could not find a better man to take care of her. How pathetic." I took a slow sip of my water. "I am doing perfectly fine, Preston. You might want to worry about your own sinking ship." He let out a harsh laugh. "Right. Deflect all you want. You are 30 alone and clearly struggling to make ends meet." Right at that moment, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open. A little boy wearing a sharp miniature tuxedo darted through the crowd. His eyes locked onto me, his face lighting up with absolute joy. Mom Miles called out, running full speed until he crashed into my legs, wrapping his small arms tightly around my waist. I melted instantly, crouching down to kiss his forehead. "Hey there, sweetie. Did you have fun looking at the ice sculptures in the lobby?" Preston stared at the boy in revulsion. "So this is the tragic baggage that ruined everything. You actually brought him here. You are still dragging around your mistakes. I see, and you are still completely alone." Actually, a deep, resonant voice echoed from right behind Preston, freezing the very air in the room. "She is far from alone." A heavy, commanding hand landed squarely on Preston's shoulder, forcing him to turn around. Preston's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Standing there was Dominic. At 35, Dominic was an absolute titan in the corporate restructuring world. He was the chief executive of Apex Holdings, an apex predator who bought distressed companies and dismantled them for parts. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal suit, exuding an aura of absolute power and quiet danger. Preston went entirely pale. His flashy tech startup was not about to go public. It was hemorrhaging money. For the last 6 months, Preston had been desperately begging for a meeting with Apex Holdings, seeking a critical bridge loan to avoid total bankruptcy. Dominic was the exact corporate liquidator, holding the financial guillotine directly over Preston's neck. "Mr. Sinclair," Preston stammered, choking on his drink. His entire posture shifted to a groveling subordinate. "I had no idea you attended this university. I have been trying to get your office on the line for weeks regarding my firm funding. It is an honor to cross paths tonight." Dominic did not even look at Preston's outstretched hand. He stepped smoothly past him, pulling me gently by the waist and kissing my cheek. Miles immediately reached his arms up. Dad the little boy cheered. Dominic scooped the 6-year-old up with effortless affection, resting the boy comfortably on his hip. Preston looked as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. "Dad," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically between me, Miles, and the billionaire holding him. "Wait, Cassidy. You two are together. Is this man bothering you, my love?" Dominic asked me, his tone smooth but laced with a lethal edge. "Just an old acquaintance offering unsolicited life advice," I replied, adjusting Dominic's tie. He was just explaining how pathetic my life turned out. Dominic slowly turned his gaze back to Preston. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Preston, isn't it?" Dominic said softly. "Chief executive of that failing startup?" "Yes, your file crossed my desk yesterday. My analysts noted your aggressive cash burn rate and your highly creative accounting practices." Preston was sweating profusely now. "Mr. Sinclair, please, I can explain the quarterly reports. The projections are solid. We just need the capital to scale our operations." "What you need," Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is a lesson in respect. The woman you just called a pathetic mistake is my wife. The boy you called baggage is my legally adopted son. And the company you are currently begging to save your miserable career is effectively owned by me." The surrounding alumni had stopped talking, openly staring at the scene. Preston looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization that he had just publicly insulted the family of his only potential savior paralyzed him. "As for your funding," Dominic continued, staring at Preston with clinical detachment, "consider your application formally denied. My firm does not invest in sinking ships, and we certainly do not do business with men who lack basic human decency. Now I suggest you walk away before I have security escort you out of my wife's reunion." Preston swallowed hard, his face flushed with ultimate humiliation. He looked at me, realizing the woman he discarded was now untouchable. Without a single word, he turned on his heel and fled the ballroom. Dominic set Miles down and wrapped his arms around me. "Are you all right?" he murmured. I smiled. "I am perfectly fine." But as I watched Preston retreat, I saw him glance back over his shoulder. His eyes burned with a desperate, venomous rage. I knew a man with an ego that fragile would not just disappear quietly. The real war had not even started yet. My ex-husband humiliated himself at our reunion, unaware that my new husband was the billionaire holding his company's debt. But as he fled, I knew his ego would not let it go. The next morning, my mother called screaming that my father was having a heart attack. I rushed to their estate, only to find them sipping wine with the man who ruined my life, demanding I divorce my husband to save their reputation. My name is Cassidy. At 30, I built a successful forensic accounting firm after my ex-husband left me destitute. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a manipulative ex try to turn your family against you. Dominic held me close as Preston disappeared. I knew a man fueled by toxic arrogance would not accept defeat. Preston was a cornered animal looking for easy prey. In his case, that prey was my status-obsessed parents, Richard and Patricia. The next morning, my phone rang. The caller identification showed my mother's name. I usually let her calls go to voicemail, but she rang 3 times. When I answered, her voice was a frantic shriek. "Cassidy, you need to come to the house right now. It is your father. He collapsed in the study. The paramedics are on their way. I think it is his heart. Please hurry." Panic seized my chest. Despite everything Richard and Patricia had done, they were still my parents. I shouted for Dominic, who took over making breakfast for Miles. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and drove recklessly fast. I broke speed limits, trying to reach their sprawling suburban estate, praying I would not be late. I sprinted up the manicured walkway and threw open the heavy oak doors, fully expecting to see stretchers and paramedics. Instead, the house was perfectly quiet. The rich scent of roasted garlic and truffle oil drifted down the hallway. Confused and panting, I slowly walked toward the formal dining room, my adrenaline turning into cold dread. What I saw froze my blood. There were no paramedics. There was no emergency. The polished dining table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. Sitting at the head of the table, looking incredibly relaxed with a glass of red wine, was Preston. My father, supposedly fighting for his life, was sitting right next to him, laughing loudly at a joke Preston just made. My mother was pouring more wine, wearing a silk blouse and pristine pearls, completely unbothered. I stood in the doorway, chest heaving, staring at the sheer absurdity. "You told me he was having a massive heart attack," I said, my voice shaking with profound relief and searing anger. Patricia set the bottle down, not looking the least bit guilty. "Oh, do not be so dramatic. I said he had a severe palpitation, which he did. The stress of your recent behavior is taking a toll on his health. We had to get you over here somehow, and you never answer our calls. Come sit down." Preston was gracious enough to bring us a beautiful Cabernet to calm our nerves. Preston swirled the ruby liquid, his eyes locking onto mine. The absolute terror he had displayed at the gala was entirely gone, replaced by a calculated confidence. He knew my parents worshipped wealth and outward appearances above all else, and he knew exactly how to buy their unwavering loyalty. He looked at me like he had already won. "I am not sitting anywhere near him," I stated firmly, taking a deliberate step back. "You faked a medical emergency to lure me here. Have you completely lost your minds? I am leaving right now." "Sit down right now, Richard," bellowed, his fist slamming violently against the polished wood table. The sudden aggression stopped me dead in my tracks. He stood up, his face red with self-righteous indignation. "You will show some respect in this house. Preston came to us this morning in tears, telling us about the humiliating, cruel spectacle you caused late last night. You paraded around some ruthless corporate liquidator pretending to be married to him, just to maliciously sabotage Preston's business funding. I am legally married to him." I fired back, my voice echoing loudly in the room. "Dominic is my husband, and I did not sabotage anything. Preston insulted my child and humiliated himself in front of the one man who could save his failing company." "Do not talk back to your father," Patricia snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "We know all about Dominic. He is a corporate vulture who destroys companies and ruins lives for profit. Preston, on the other hand, is a true visionary, building an empire that will secure our family legacy for generations. We will not allow you to ruin that out of some petty, lingering bitterness over your failed marriage. Preston is family. You are just being an incredibly spiteful and selfish child." I stared at the two people who were supposed to protect me, realizing they had completely sold their souls to the man who once threw me out on the street. They did not care that he had insulted their own grandson. They only cared about the prestige he supposedly offered them. Richard walked around the table, stopping just inches from me. "You are going to fix this massive mistake, Cassidy," he demanded, his voice intensely threatening. "You are going to divorce that liquidator immediately. You will apologize to Preston and you will remarry him. He has generously agreed to take you back, and even tolerate the boy provided you do exactly as we say to save our family honor." I let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, shaking my head. "You are completely delusional if you think I would ever go near him again. Why are you doing this? Why are you protecting the very man who threw your own daughter out on the streets when she was pregnant and left her completely destitute?" Preston stood up slowly, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. He walked over to stand beside my father, patting Richard on the shoulder like a loyal business partner. "Because, Cassidy," he whispered, his voice dripping with absolute malice, "your parents are smart enough to understand high-level finance. They know family honor is tied to family wealth, and right now their entire future, their estate, and their precious social standing are completely tied to my company. If my company goes under because of your new husband, your parents go completely down with me." I stared at Preston, letting his sickening words echo in the silent dining room. He actually believed he had won. He stood there swirling his expensive wine, looking at my father as if they were business partners who had just cornered a hostile takeover. My own parents were nodding along with him. "I am not divorcing my husband to save your failing company," I told Preston, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. And I am certainly not remarrying you. You are a fraud, Preston. You always have been. Dominic is going to liquidate your startup, and there is absolutely nothing I will do to stop him. Patricia slammed her wine glass down on the table. The crystal rang sharply against the wood. How dare you speak to him that way, she hissed, stepping toward me with her face twisted in disgust. You have always been an ungrateful, selfish disappointment. Preston is a visionary. He is building something that matters. What have you ever done? You hid in the shadows, playing a little accountant, tricking a wealthy man into marrying you, just so you could finally feel important. You are a terrible daughter, and an even worse mother for bringing that boy into this world and ruining your first marriage. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She was talking about Miles. My mother was actually blaming me for keeping my son, the same son Preston had demanded I terminate. The level of delusion was staggering. You are defending the man who left me with nothing, I said, looking at my father, begging him to show a shred of humanity. Richard, you are my father. He threw me out on the street. He drained my savings. How can you possibly sit there and take his side? Richard adjusted his perfectly tailored cuffs and refused to meet my eyes. We are looking at the bigger picture, Cassidy. Business is business. Preston had to make tough choices to build his empire. You were holding him back. Now he is offering to elevate this family to a level of wealth and prestige we deserve. You are the only obstacle in our way. Preston chuckled, walking over to the sideboard to pour himself another glass of wine. He took his time, savoring the absolute control he thought he had over the room. It is not just about future wealth, Cassidy, he said smoothly. It is about immediate survival. Your father mentioned that their estate is tied to my company, but I do not think you fully grasp the gravity of the situation. He pulled a folded legal document from his inner suit jacket pocket and tossed it onto the dining table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping right in front of me. Go ahead, Preston urged, gesturing toward the paper. Read it. I did not want to touch anything he handed me, but my training as a forensic accountant took over. I picked up the document and scanned the first page. The legal jargon jumped out at me instantly. It was a loan agreement. Specifically, it was a second mortgage taken out on my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The principal amount was staggering. $750,000, I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper as the reality sank in. I looked up at Richard and Patricia, who were suddenly avoiding my gaze. You took out a $750,000 mortgage on your home to fund my Series A investment round, Preston confirmed, his smile widening into a predatory grin. Your parents are my largest angel investors. They believed in my vision when you did not. They leveraged everything they owned, their house, their retirement, their social standing, to back my company. I felt physically sick. You gave him your house? I asked my mother, my voice trembling with a mix of horror and disgust. You handed over $750,000 to the man who abused your daughter. It was an investment, Patricia snapped defensively, a guaranteed return. Preston promised us a triple payout once the company went public. We were securing our retirement. We were securing our legacy at the country club. But his company is not going public, I said, my voice rising as I pointed a finger at Preston. His company is drowning in toxic debt. He is running a massive deficit. Dominic is going to seize all his assets by the end of the month. Your investment is completely gone. Which is exactly why you are going to fix this, Richard roared, stepping forward again. You are going to call that liquidator husband of yours right now. You are going to tell him to drop the debt collection against Preston. You will force him to forgive the loans, or so help me. You will be responsible for making your own parents homeless. The sheer audacity of the blackmail left me momentarily speechless. They were holding their own financial ruin over my head, using their impending homelessness to force me to betray my husband and save my abuser. If Dominic seizes my assets, your parents lose the house, Preston said, stepping intimately close to me, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper. The bank will foreclose on this beautiful estate in less than 30 days. They will be out on the street. All their country club friends will watch them pack their bags into a cheap moving truck. They will be a public laughingstock, and it will be entirely your fault. I clutched the mortgage document in my hand, my knuckles turning white. You manipulated them, I said to Preston. You knew you were failing, and you used their greed to steal their home. They were willing participants, Preston countered smoothly. Now pull out your phone, Cassidy. Call Dominic. Tell him to back off Nexus Solutions. Tell him to wipe the slate clean. If you do not, I will personally make sure every single person in this city knows that Cassidy Sinclair let her elderly parents get thrown onto the street because she was too spiteful to forgive an old grudge. The room felt suffocating. Patricia was glaring at me with pure hatred. Richard was standing by the door, physically blocking my exit. Preston was holding out his hand, demanding I give him my phone to make the call. I was completely cornered in the very house I grew up in. They had trapped me in a web of financial ruin and toxic guilt, expecting me to fold just like I used to when I was younger. I looked at my phone, my mind racing through crisis management protocols. I needed to get out of this room. I needed to call Dominic and my security team. Preston took another step closer, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. I said, "Make the call, Cassidy." Before his fingers could even brush my sleeve, a loud, heavy crash echoed through the hallway. The sound of the solid oak front door being kicked open violently shattered the tense silence in the dining room. Richard jumped backward, startled. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls. Preston spun around, dropping his hand. Heavy, determined footsteps marched down the marble hallway, growing louder and faster. I turned toward the dining room entrance, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing in the archway, dripping with rain and radiating absolute fury, was my older sister, Nicole. And standing right beside her, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, was her husband, Kendrick. Kendrick was a former federal financial crimes investigator, a towering African-American man who currently ran one of the most ruthless private security firms in the city. Kendrick slowly took off his soaking wet coat, his dark eyes locking onto Preston with the intensity of a predator who had just found his prey. "Nobody is making any calls," Kendrick said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, unmistakable warning. "But you all might want to call a lawyer." The silence in the dining room shattered as my father finally found his voice. Richard puffed out his chest, marching toward the archway with his face flushed a deep, angry purple. He pointed a trembling finger at my brother-in-law. "Get out of my house right now," Richard demanded, his voice thick with outrage. "You have no right to kick open my door like some street thug. I will not have people like you bringing your aggressive behavior into my home. We are conducting private family business." Kendrick did not even blink. At 6'3", my African-American brother-in-law possessed the kind of quiet, immovable authority that made men like my father look incredibly small. Kendrick slowly unbuttoned his soaked overcoat, ignoring Richard completely. Nicole bypassed our father and rushed straight to my side. She grabbed my trembling hands, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of physical harm. "I texted Kendrick the moment you sent me your location," she whispered fiercely. "I knew they were setting you up." Patricia clutched her wine glass, her knuckles white. "Nicole, control your husband?" My mother snapped, her tone dripping with that familiar condescending elitism. "This is exactly why we never invite him to the country club. He has absolutely no respect for boundaries or civilized society." "Civilized society," Kendrick repeated. His deep, resonant voice easily overpowered my parents' hysterical demands. He took 3 deliberate steps into the room, stopping directly across from Preston. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He tossed it onto the dining table. It landed with a loud smack right on top of Preston's mortgage document. "If taking out a fraudulent second mortgage to fund a sinking Ponzi scheme is your idea of civilized," Kendrick said calmly, "then you are in for a very rude awakening." Preston scoffed, though I could see a bead of sweat forming at his hairline. He tried to puff out his chest, mirroring my father. "You are a glorified security guard, Kendrick. You have absolutely no idea how high-level venture capital works. You are out of your depth." Kendrick smiled, but it was a cold, terrifying expression. "I spent 10 years at the Federal Bureau of Investigation tracking financial crimes before I opened my security firm. Tracking your clumsy money laundering took my team less than 48 hours. He reached across the table and flipped the folder open. He spread a series of highlighted bank statements and wire transfer logs across the polished wood. I stepped closer, looking at the numbers. "Let us educate your investors," Kendrick said, gesturing to the papers. "Richard Patricia, you took out a $750,000 loan against this estate. You wired it to Nexus Solutions last Tuesday. Preston told you it was for research and development to prepare for an initial public offering." "He is a visionary," Patricia interrupted fiercely. "He is building the future." "He is buying a yacht," Kendrick corrected bluntly. He tapped a highlighted line on the top document. Thursday morning, $400,000 was transferred from the Nexus corporate account into a Cayman Islands holding company. From there, it was wired to a luxury marine broker in Monaco. The remaining $350,000 went toward paying off his personal gambling debts and leasing a new penthouse. Not a single cent went into his business. The room went entirely still. I looked at my parents, waiting for the realization to wash over them. I waited for the shock, the anger at being conned, the horrifying understanding that they had mortgaged their home to fund Preston's lavish lifestyle. Preston laughed nervously, waving a dismissive hand. "This is completely fabricated. This is corporate espionage. I move funds offshore for tax optimization purposes. It is standard operating procedure for tech founders." Kendrick stared him down. "Tax optimization requires generating actual profit. Your company has not turned a profit in 3 years. You are using new investor money to pay off old debts and fund your personal life. You are actively laundering your in-laws' mortgage money right in front of them." I looked at my mother. Patricia was staring at the documents. Her lips were parted, her eyes wide. Surely the undeniable proof from a former federal agent was enough to shatter the illusion. Instead, my mother did something that truly broke my heart. She looked away from the documents, lifted her chin, and glared at Kendrick with pure, unadulterated venom. "This is pathetic," Patricia sneered. "You fabricated these papers because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Preston. He is a brilliant, educated executive, and you are just a hired muscle trying to drag a successful man down to your level." I gasped, stunned by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. "Mom, the proof is right in front of you. He is stealing your house." "Do not call me your mother," Richard roared, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Preston. My father looked at Nicole, then at me. His eyes were devoid of any parental love. "You two brought this aggressive liar into my home to frame the only man who is actually trying to elevate this family. You are both incredibly selfish, ungrateful traitors. As of this moment, you are officially disowned. You are dead to us. Get out of my house before I call the police." Nicole let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You are choosing a con artist over your own daughters. Enjoy losing your house, Richard." Preston stood taller, his panic completely evaporating. He realized his meat shields were impenetrable. My parents were so blinded by their own prejudice and greed that they would defend him straight into bankruptcy. Preston looked at me, a wicked smirk returning to his face. "You heard your father, Cassidy. You and your little security guard are done here. I gave you a chance to save them, but you chose to be difficult. Consider this war. I will destroy your reputation, and then I will take everything else you care about." Kendrick gently placed his hand on my shoulder, guiding me and Nicole toward the door. We left them standing in their grand dining room, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just sealed their own doom. But as we walked out into the rain, I knew Preston was right about one thing. This was war, and he was about to unleash a nightmare. The drive home from my parents' estate was completely silent. Kendrick drove while Nicole held my hand in the back seat. I watched the city lights blur through the rain-streaked windows. I knew Preston was backed into a corner. A narcissist stripped of his funding and exposed in front of his biggest supporters would not retreat. He would retaliate with everything he had. I just did not anticipate how low he was willing to go. The attack began before the sun even came up. At 5 in the morning, my phone started vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. I reached out in the dark, blinking against the bright screen. There were 40 missed calls and dozens of text messages from my employees, friends, and industry contacts. I opened a link sent by my lead investigator. It led to a popular financial news blog. The horrifying headline instantly made my blood run completely cold. The corporate spy who seduced a billionaire to destroy a tech visionary. Preston had gone to the media. He had spent the last of his stolen funds to buy targeted hit pieces across multiple tabloid sites and tech blogs. I sat up in bed reading the vicious lies he had fabricated. The article painted Preston as a brilliant, hardworking founder who was on the verge of changing the world with his startup. Then it introduced me as his bitter, money-hungry ex-wife. According to the paid story, I had built my forensic accounting firm specifically to conduct corporate espionage. It claimed I stole trade secrets from his company and then seduced the wealthy corporate liquidator Dominic to orchestrate a hostile takeover. Preston was playing the ultimate victim. He claimed my parents had generously invested their life savings into his company, and I was trying to bankrupt him just to spite my own family. The narrative was expertly crafted to destroy my professional credibility. As a seasoned forensic accountant, my entire business model relies completely on maintaining absolute trust, total discretion, and unshakable integrity with my clients. If corporations thought I was a spy who leaked financial data to rival billionaires, my agency would collapse overnight. By 8 o'clock, the nightmare escalated from internet gossip to real-world consequences. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop. My professional inbox was flooded with urgent emails. Then my office phone suddenly rang. It was the chief financial officer of a major logistics company, one of my most lucrative clients. Cassidy, he said, his voice tense and formal. We saw the articles circulating this morning. You understand that our ongoing fraud investigation requires absolute confidentiality. If there is even a fraction of truth to these rumors about you sharing data with Apex Holdings, we have to terminate our contract immediately. I spent the next 2 hours doing intense crisis management. I assured my clients that the articles were baseless defamation from a desperate ex-husband. I promised them that our secure servers had never been breached and that their data was entirely isolated. Some clients agreed to wait, but others placed our contracts on immediate suspension. Preston was actively destroying the business I had spent 6 years building from nothing. The door to my office opened. Dominic walked in holding his tablet. His face was a mask of terrifying icy calm, but I knew my husband well enough to see the lethal fury burning in his eyes. He placed the tablet on my desk. It displayed yet another hit piece. This one featured quotes from my own parents, Richard and Patricia. They had willingly and publicly backed Preston, telling the local reporter that their own daughter was a deeply troubled, jealous woman who simply wanted to destroy a good, honest man out of pure, unadulterated spite. I have my legal team on standby, Dominic said quietly. His voice carried the weight of an impending execution. We are filing a massive defamation lawsuit. I am going to freeze his remaining personal accounts, gag the publications, and bankrupt him so thoroughly he will not be able to afford a cup of coffee. He crossed the line when he put your name in the press, Cassidy. I will crush him into dust by noon. I looked at the fierce protection in Dominic's eyes. It was tempting to let him unleash his corporate attorneys and bury Preston under a mountain of litigation. But lawsuits took months, sometimes years, to resolve. A defamation case would just give Preston more media attention and a platform to play the victim. He would drag the proceedings out while my business bled clients. No, I said, reaching out to gently close Dominic's tablet. Call off the lawyers. Do not file anything. Dominic frowned, leaning forward with his hands on my desk. Cassidy, he is destroying your reputation. We cannot just let him run a smear campaign. I am not letting him do anything, I replied, pulling my keyboard closer to me. Preston thinks he can use public relations to hide his financial crimes. He wants us distracted by tabloids so we do not look closer at the numbers Kendrick brought to dinner last night. He is hiding something massive. If we sue him for defamation, it becomes a civil dispute. But if I find out exactly where that mortgage money went, we can bypass civil court entirely. Dominic slowly stood up, a proud, sharp smile touching the corners of his mouth. He knew exactly what I was about to do. "I am going to let you work," he murmured, kissing the top of my head before stepping out of the office and closing the door softly behind him. I was a forensic accountant. Finding buried money was not just my job, it was my absolute specialty. I pulled out the dossier Kendrick had dropped on my parents' dining table. I looked at the highlighted wire transfers. $400,000 routed to a Cayman Islands holding company, then split into fractions and sent to Monaco. Preston thought he was clever by using offshore shell corporations, but white-collar criminals always leave a digital fingerprint. I booted up my encrypted servers and accessed the international corporate registry databases my firm used for deep-dive investigations. I started tracing the origin points of Nexus Solutions' initial seed funding. I cross-referenced the Cayman Islands routing numbers with public maritime registries in Monaco to find the yacht broker Preston used. I spent 6 hours peeling back the layers of Preston's financial labyrinth. I ignored my ringing phone and the new articles popping up online. I followed the incredibly complex digital trail of every single dollar that entered and exited his tech company over the last 3 years. I tracked the false revenue reports he submitted to his current investors. Then I found the anomaly. It was deliberately hidden deep within a completely undocumented secondary offshore shell company that he had fraudulently registered directly under his own mother's maiden name. The money my parents gave him was not just being washed through luxury purchases. I analyzed the incoming deposits to the Cayman account and matched them against Nexus Solutions' investor list. A cold, remarkably heavy realization settled over me as the final devastating puzzle pieces finally snapped perfectly into place on my glowing monitor. What Preston was doing was not just bad business or reckless spending, he was executing a highly specific, coordinated financial structure. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I had found the exact mechanism he was using to fake his corporate growth. It was not just debt, it was a federal felony. I had the proof. The undeniable digital footprint of a massive federal felony sat right on my glowing monitor. Preston was not just a failing tech founder making reckless investments to save his company. He was a white-collar criminal running a highly sophisticated money laundering operation through offshore shell corporations. I securely exported the entire financial matrix to an encrypted hard drive, preparing to hand the devastating files over to Kendrick to leverage his extensive federal contacts. But Preston, realizing his pathetic tabloid smear campaign was not forcing me to surrender, decided to escalate his attacks to a level of depravity I had never anticipated. When a narcissist loses their financial control, they aim for the most vulnerable target available to inflict maximum emotional damage. He went after my absolute weakest point. He went after my son. The very next morning, the crisp autumn air felt sharp as I walked 6-year-old Miles up the stone steps of his elite private elementary school. Dominic had an early board meeting across town regarding a new acquisition, so it was just the two of us for the morning routine. I kissed Miles on the cheek, straightened his little backpack, and watched him run inside the brick building to join his friends. I turned around to walk back to my car, my mind focused entirely on the offshore accounts I needed to dismantle with Kendrick later that afternoon. I was already mentally drafting the legal briefs. A sudden blinding flash of a camera completely stopped me in my tracks. Cassidy Sinclair, a loud, abrasive voice shouted across the crowded school courtyard. "Care to comment on the emergency custody petition being filed against you this morning?" I blinked away the harsh light. Blocking the pathway to my vehicle was a sleazy local tabloid reporter holding a digital audio recorder. Standing right beside him, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a sickening mask of manufactured grief, was Preston. Flanking them both was a stern-looking man holding a thick stack of legal documents. Parents who were dropping off their own children stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide as they watched the spectacle unfold. Preston looked directly at the camera and let out a shaky, dramatic sigh. He was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime for the local news. "I just want my boy back," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. "I have been kept away from my biological son for 6 long years by a deeply bitter woman. Now that she has brought a dangerous corporate liquidator into his life, I have to step in and protect my child. My blood turned to absolute ice. The sheer audacity of his lies paralyzed me for a split second. The man who had explicitly demanded I terminate my pregnancy, the man who had abandoned me without a single penny, was now standing in front of a camera, playing the victimized, loving father. The stern man stepped forward and shoved the heavy stack of papers directly into my chest. "You have been served," the process server announced loudly. I caught the heavy documents before they hit the concrete. My eyes scanned the bold black print on the first page. It was an emergency custody petition. My hands began to shake with a mixture of profound disbelief and uncontrollable rage as I read the fraudulent claims. Preston was officially petitioning the family court for full immediate custody of Miles. He falsely claimed to be the devoted biological father who had been systematically alienated by a vindictive, unstable ex-wife. But that was not the worst part. I flipped to the second page and felt the breath completely leave my lungs. The petition accused Dominic and me of severe child endangerment, claiming our home was an abusive, hostile environment. To back up these horrific accusations, Preston had attached 2 sworn notarized affidavits. The signatures at the bottom belonged to my own parents. Richard and Patricia had actually committed federal perjury. They swore under oath that I was an unfit, neglectful mother, and that Preston was a loving, capable father who deserved full custody of his rightful heir. My parents had sold me out completely. They were so utterly terrified of losing their mortgaged suburban estate to Preston's failing company that they were willing to help a monster rip my 6-year-old son away from me. The depths of their toxic betrayal defied all logic. The reporter shoved the microphone closer to my face. "Your own parents have signed sworn statements claiming you are a serious danger to the boy. How do you respond to the allegations that your new marriage is a toxic environment for a child?" I looked at the reporter, then at Preston. Preston was staring at me with a look of absolute triumph. He thought he had found the ultimate leverage. He thought attacking my child would break me in a way the financial threats had not. He fully expected me to scream, to cry, to lose my composure in front of the cameras and give them the exact unhinged reaction they wanted for their evening news broadcast. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I tapped into the cold, clinical detachment I used when dismantling corporate fraudsters. I looked directly into the camera lens. "These allegations are completely fabricated." I stated, my voice calm and perfectly leveled. "My legal team will handle this harassment suit in court, and the individuals who committed perjury today will face the maximum legal consequences." Preston's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He did not expect me to be so remarkably composed. He took a step closer, gesturing for the reporter to give us a moment. He leaned in, bringing his mouth right next to my ear, so the microphone could not pick up his voice. "You put up a good front, Cassidy," Preston whispered, his breath hot against my cheek. "But we both know you cannot risk the massive media circus this will cause for Dominic's pristine corporate image. A nasty custody battle will drag his name through the mud. It will tank his stock prices." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with him. "What do you want, Preston?" He smirked, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation. "It is very simple. You call Dominic right now. You tell him to wire $5 million directly into my personal offshore account by noon. Once the transfer clears, I will drop the custody suit. I will tear up your parents' affidavits. You can keep the kid and I will completely disappear. If the money is not there, I will make sure social services rips that boy out of your house tonight." He leaned back, adjusting his expensive tie, waiting for me to shatter. He expected me to pull out my phone and beg my incredibly wealthy husband for the ransom money to save my son. I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I reached into my designer handbag. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a crisp white envelope sealed with a thick red wax stamp. It was a document I had kept safely locked away for 6 entire years, waiting for the exact day Preston's arrogant delusions would finally blind him to reality. I looked at Preston, letting a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. I pressed the sealed envelope flat against his chest. I suggest you open this before you walk into a courtroom, Preston, I said softly. Because you are going to need a much better lawyer. Preston snatched the envelope from my hand, his smug facade faltering for only a fraction of a second before his toxic arrogance fully returned. He let out a condescending scoff, tapping the thick paper against his palm. You really think some pathetic forged legal threat is going to stop me from taking my son? He sneered, turning his back on me to pose for the lingering paparazzi. See you in court, Cassidy. 2 hours later, we were sitting inside the sterile wood-paneled family courtroom. Preston sat at the petitioner's table with his overpriced flashy attorney, looking entirely too confident. He had not opened the envelope. His ego was so massive that he genuinely believed I was bluffing, assuming I was just a desperate mother trying to scare him off. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his miserable life. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, called the emergency custody hearing to order. Preston immediately took the stand. He launched into a performance worthy of a national acting award. He manufactured real tears, his voice breaking at the perfect intervals as he spun a horrifyingly convincing tale. Your Honor, I just want to see my boy Preston choked out, wiping his eyes with a pristine handkerchief. I am his biological father. I have been kept away from him for 6 years by a woman who is deeply unstable. She alienated me from my own flesh and blood. Now she has brought a ruthless, dangerous corporate liquidator into his life. I am terrified for my son's safety. I have sworn affidavits from her own parents, Richard and Patricia, attesting to her severe neglect and my capability as a loving father. Please, you have to grant me immediate custody. The judge looked visibly moved. She flipped through the fraudulent affidavits my parents had signed, her expression darkening as she read their blatant lies. She turned her gaze toward my table, her eyes filled with strict judicial scrutiny. I sat perfectly still. My high-profile family attorney, a brilliant strategist named Harrison, stood up smoothly. He carried the sealed envelope I had pressed against Preston's chest earlier that morning. Your Honor, Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. The petitioner has just committed severe, verifiable federal perjury in your courtroom. He is not the biological father of this child. In fact, it is a biological impossibility for him to father any child. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Preston froze on the witness stand, his fake tears instantly drying up. His attorney jumped to his feet, objecting loudly, calling the claim a desperate smear tactic. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order. She instructed Harrison to approach the bench with his evidence. Harrison opened the envelope and handed a thick stack of certified notarized medical records directly to the judge. The petitioner is claiming biological paternity to establish emergency standing. Harrison continued pacing steadily in front of the witness stand. However, those certified records from a prominent university medical center prove that Preston suffered a severe catastrophic sports injury during his sophomore year of college. The trauma required emergency surgery and left him completely and irreversibly sterile, a condition known as absolute azoospermia. Preston turned the color of chalk. His jaw dropped, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and absolute terror. He had hidden his sterility from me during our entire marriage, using my supposed inability to conceive as another weapon to gaslight and demean me. Furthermore, Harrison stated, his voice echoing loudly off the courtroom walls, we have attached the certified fertility clinic documents from 6 years ago. After the petitioner abandoned my client and finalized their separation, my client sought out an anonymous sperm donor. Miles was conceived completely independently of the petitioner. Preston has absolutely zero biological, legal, or moral ties to this child. He knew this, yet he filed a fraudulent emergency petition and coerced 2 individuals into signing perjured affidavits simply to extort my client for a $5 million ransom. The judge read through the highlighted medical files, her face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. She slammed the documents down on her desk and glared at Preston with a look that could cut glass. Is this true? The judge demanded, her voice dripping with lethal outrage. Did you knowingly lie to this court and submit fraudulent documents to kidnap a child that does not belong to you? Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his attorney, who was frantically packing his briefcase, clearly realizing his client had just exposed him to massive legal liability. This emergency custody petition is immediately dismissed with prejudice. The judge roared, banging her gavel so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. I am sanctioning the petitioner for gross misconduct and blatant perjury. I am also forwarding these fraudulent parental affidavits directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Get out of my courtroom before I hold you in contempt and have the bailiff arrest you right now. Preston scrambled off the witness stand, his face burning with the ultimate crushing humiliation. His master plan to extort Dominic and steal my son had just blown up spectacularly, leaving him with even more legal jeopardy. I walked out of the courtroom feeling a profound, absolute sense of victory. I had protected my son without spending a single dime of Dominic's money. But as I stepped into the courthouse hallway, Preston was waiting near the elevators. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot with manic, venomous hatred. He realized he could not touch me. He realized Dominic was too heavily guarded, too powerful, and too deeply entrenched in corporate security for him to ever approach. Preston stepped into my path, completely ignoring the warning glare from my attorney. "You think you won, Cassidy?" Preston hissed, his voice trembling with dark, uncontained malice. "You think you can humiliate me and just walk away?" "You did this to yourself, Preston," I replied coldly, stepping around him. "You are finished." Preston grabbed the door of the elevator just as it began to close. "I cannot touch your billionaire husband," he whispered, a sick, twisted smile creeping onto his face. "And I cannot touch your kid. But your older sister does not have a private security detail, does she? Nicole runs that cute little boutique downtown all by herself. It would be a real tragedy if something catastrophic happened to the only family member you actually love." The elevator doors slid shut, severing his face from my view. A new, terrifying chill washed over me. Preston had nothing left to lose, and he had just declared an entirely new kind of war. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing away Preston and his sickening threat. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I immediately pulled out my phone with trembling hands and dialed my sister. It went straight to voicemail. I called my brother-in-law next. Kendrick answered on the second ring, his deep voice instantly grounding my escalating panic. I told him exactly what Preston had said outside the courtroom, repeating the specific threat against the downtown boutique. Kendrick did not hesitate. He ordered me to go home, lock the doors, and let him handle the security perimeter. Dominic had our own private security detail doubled within the hour. We waited in agonizing tension. The retaliation did not happen that afternoon. Preston was a coward who preferred the cover of darkness. At 3 a.m, my phone vibrated violently against the nightstand. I grabbed it, seeing Nicole's name illuminating the dark room. Her voice was shaking thick with unshed tears. She told me to come to the arts district immediately. Dominic and I arrived 20 minutes later. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the wet pavement. My stomach dropped into my shoes when I saw the storefront. The beautiful custom plate glass windows of Nicole's high-end boutique were entirely shattered. Shards of thick glass covered the sidewalk like jagged ice. Inside, the devastation was absolute. Racks of expensive, curated designer inventory had been slashed to ribbons. Dark paint was splashed across the antique display cases and the pristine hardwood floors. The cash registers were smashed, but the money inside was completely untouched. This was not a robbery. This was a highly targeted, malicious execution. It was a message written in shattered glass telling me to back off. I found Nicole standing near the back office, shivering in a thick tactical coat Kendrick had draped over her shoulders. She was staring blankly at a ruined silk gown she had spent months sourcing from Italy. I ran to her, wrapping my arms around her tight. The guilt crashed over me in a suffocating, paralyzing wave. This was entirely my fault. Preston realized he could not touch my billionaire husband, and he could not steal my son through the legal system, so he went after the only vulnerable target I loved. He destroyed my sister's livelihood simply because I had the audacity to stand up to his extortion in family court. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at the ruined shop. I pulled back from the hug and grabbed Nicole's hands. "I am paying for all of this," I said, my voice thick with emotion, but laced with absolute resolve. "I will cover the commercial insurance deductibles. I will replace every single piece of ruined inventory. I will hire private contractors tomorrow morning to fix the glass, the custom displays, and the flooring. Whatever it costs to rebuild your business, I am covering it completely out of my own pocket." Before Nicole could even formulate a response, a large, steady hand rested firmly on my shoulder. Kendrick stepped into the light, his jaw set in a rigid, terrifying line. He looked at the destruction around us, but his dark eyes were completely devoid of panic. Instead, they burned with the cold, calculating intensity of a seasoned federal agent stepping back onto a hostile battlefield. "You are not writing a single check," Cassidy Kendrick said, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of the police radios outside. This stopped being about money the second that coward decided to launch a physical attack against my wife. I looked up at my brother-in-law, my vision blurred with tears. "Kendrick, please," I begged. "Preston did this because of me. He is trying to drain my resources and break my spirit by hurting the people I care about. I brought this chaos to your doorstep. I have to fix it." "You cannot fix a physical threat with a corporate checkbook," Kendrick replied smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Preston thinks he is playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess. He thinks he can use hired street thugs to intimidate us, while hiding safely behind his luxury penthouse security. But he made a massive, fatal miscalculation tonight. He forgot exactly who he was dealing with." Kendrick walked over to the ruined front counter. The primary security cameras had been systematically smashed with baseball bats. The recording server was soaked in acidic paint. The local police officers had already written it off as a total technological loss, noting that the perpetrators knew exactly where the blind spots were. But Kendrick simply smirked. "When I married your sister," he said, pulling a specialized decryption tablet from his jacket pocket, "I did not just install standard commercial alarms. I ran this building's security architecture, using the exact same covert surveillance protocols I utilized during my 10 years at the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He bypassed the destroyed commercial server entirely and connected his tablet to a hidden encrypted tactical node secured inside the reinforced ceiling beams. Within seconds, pristine high-definition night vision footage populated his screen. Dominic and I stepped closer, watching the digital playback. At exactly 2 in the morning, 3 men wearing dark hoodies and surgical masks had breached the front doors. They moved with practiced military precision, destroying the inventory in less than 4 minutes before vanishing into a waiting unmarked van in the back alley. One of the thugs had slipped up. While swinging a crowbar at the main jewelry display case, his hood fell back and his surgical mask slipped down to his chin for barely a fraction of a second. Kendrick paused the video and isolated the specific frame. He enhanced the image, zooming in on the side of the man's exposed neck. A very distinct, intricate serpent tattoo was clearly visible under the harsh security lighting. Kendrick let out a low, dangerous chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, look who decided to do some freelance vandalism," he murmured, his eyes locking onto the frozen digital image. "I know exactly who this is. I indicted him on federal racketeering charges 5 years ago. He is a mid-level enforcer who only takes contracts from desperate, wealthy clients." Kendrick closed the tablet and handed a copied memory drive to a trusted contact on the police force outside. He turned back to me, unbuttoning his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves. His transition from a protective husband to a relentless apex predator was absolute. "Preston thinks he can hire ghosts to do his dirty work," Kendrick said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "But ghosts always talk when you know exactly how to squeeze them. I am going to get the location of Preston's little hideout from our tattooed friend here. And then I think it is time I pay your ex-husband a very private late-night visit." Preston stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxury downtown penthouse, swirling a glass of scotch as he looked out over the glittering city skyline. The rain had stopped, and in his twisted mind the storm had passed. He felt a deep, intoxicating surge of power. Hiring that street crew to destroy the boutique had been a stroke of absolute genius. He assumed I was currently sitting in my house, weeping with guilt, and begging my billionaire husband to wire the $5 million just to make the nightmare stop. He thought he had successfully terrified me into submission. He poured himself another drink, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual nightmare had just stepped out of his private elevator. Kendrick did not knock. As a former federal agent who now ran the most elite private security firm in the state, bypassing commercial biometric locks and sleeping lobby guards was practically a warm-up exercise. He moved through the expansive, dimly lit penthouse with absolute silence. Preston only realized he was no longer alone when the heavy crystal decanter he was reaching for was suddenly slid across the marble counter out of his grasp. Preston spun around, dropping his glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Before he could even open his mouth to scream for security, Kendrick moved. In one fluid, terrifyingly fast motion, my brother-in-law crossed the room, grabbed Preston by the lapels of his silk robe, and slammed him backward onto his massive mahogany desk. Kendrick did not punch him. He did not leave a single bruise or scratch. He simply utilized a highly specific, agonizing pressure point technique he had perfected during his tactical training, pinning Preston completely flat against the polished wood. Preston gasped for air, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared up at the towering man standing over him. Kendrick leaned in his face, inches from Preston, his dark eyes void of any mercy. "You really thought you could send a tattooed thug to terrorize my wife and just sit up here drinking scotch?" Kendrick whispered, his deep voice vibrating with lethal calm. "You thought corporate money could protect you from a man who spent 10 years hunting down actual cartels?" Preston choked, trying to pry Kendrick's iron grip off his chest. "I do not know what you are talking about. You are trespassing. I will call the police. I will have you arrested for assault." Kendrick laughed, a low, chilling sound that made Preston freeze. "Call them, please. While we wait for the squad cars, we can discuss a man named Viper. Tall, bad attitude, intricate serpent tattoo on his neck. My team tracked him down 30 minutes ago. It took exactly one mention of federal racketeering charges for him to hand over the burner phone he used to communicate with you. I have the digital trail of the wire transfer you sent him to vandalize the boutique." The last shred of color completely drained from Preston's face. He suddenly realized he was not dealing with a corporate lawyer or a civil judge. He was dealing with a man who could systematically dismantle his entire life and lock him in a federal cell. "Let me educate you on how the justice system actually works for men like you," Kendrick said, pressing his forearm just a fraction of an inch deeper into Preston's chest. "You are a soft, white-collar fraudster. You belong in a minimum security resort playing tennis. But hiring violent street gangs to destroy commercial property and intimidate witnesses elevates your financial crimes to federal conspiracy and racketeering. That means maximum security. Do you have any idea what happens to arrogant, fragile tech executives in a maximum security federal penitentiary?" Preston shook his head rapidly, his breathing shallow and erratic. Tears of genuine fear pooled in his eyes. "They break you," Kendrick stated plainly, "and nobody will care. Not your investors, not your country club friends, and certainly not the parents you manipulated. Now listen to me very carefully. You are going to back off. You will not look at my wife. You will not breathe in the direction of my sister-in-law or her son. If you even think about retaliating, I will bypass the local police entirely. I will hand the burner phone, the encrypted bank records, and the surveillance footage directly to my old supervisor at the bureau. I will personally make sure you spend the next 2 decades in a concrete box." Kendrick abruptly released his grip and stepped back, smoothing the front of his jacket. Preston scrambled backward across the surface of his desk, gasping for air, clutching his chest. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly broken. "Have a good night, Preston," Kendrick said smoothly. "I suggest you spend it packing." Kendrick walked out of the penthouse, leaving the door wide open. He left Preston trembling in the dark, surrounded by shattered glass, and the crushing realization that his intimidation tactics had just secured his own destruction. When Kendrick returned to my house an hour later, he gave Dominic and me a single confirming nod. The physical threat against our family was neutralized. Preston was a coward, and cowards do not double down when faced with actual predators. We finally exhaled, believing the absolute worst of the retaliation was over. We thought we had cornered him. We assumed the morning would bring silence and surrender. We were completely wrong. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with Dominic drinking coffee while Miles watched cartoons in the living room. I turned on the television mounted above the counter, flipping to the local news station to check the traffic report for my drive to the office. Instead of a weather map, the screen displayed the bright, cheerful set of the city's most popular morning talk show. The bold graphic at the bottom of the screen read, "A family torn apart by corporate greed." My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the quartz countertop. Hot liquid splashed across the floor, but I did not even flinch. I stared at the television screen in absolute paralyzing horror. Sitting on the plush studio couches, looking directly into the camera, with perfectly manufactured expressions of profound grief and sorrow, were my own parents. Richard and Patricia had escalated the war to a catastrophic new level. If Preston could not intimidate me with violence, he was going to use them to destroy me in the court of public opinion. I listened, feeling sick to my stomach, as the talk show host leaned forward with a sympathetic frown. Richard and Patricia wiped away fake tears and began to publicly bash their own daughters on live television. The morning talk show host leaned forward with a look of deep manufactured sympathy. My mother, Patricia, dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She looked directly into the camera and delivered a performance that made my blood run completely cold. "We just want to see our grandson," Patricia cried, her voice trembling with fake sorrow. "Our daughter Cassidy married a ruthless billionaire, and the money completely changed her. She has turned into a cold, greedy monster. She is keeping little Miles away from his loving father Preston, and she has completely abandoned us." Richard nodded solemnly beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. He looked like the picture of a grieving patriarch. "Preston is a good, honest man trying to build a future," my father added smoothly. "He just wants to be part of his boy's life. But Cassidy and her new husband are using their massive wealth to crush him and silence us. We are terrified we will never see our family again." I stood in my kitchen, my hands shaking with absolute fury as the broadcast cut to a commercial break. They had done it. They had taken the private toxic abuse they had inflicted on me for years and weaponized it on live television. They were willing to paint me as a villain to millions of viewers just to protect the man who had mortgaged their home to fund his own lavish lifestyle. The fallout was instantaneous. My phone began vibrating non-stop against the quartz countertop. Social media notifications flooded my screen. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my life were already condemning me online. Hashtags demanding justice for Preston were trending within the hour. The court of public opinion had handed down a guilty verdict before I even had a chance to speak. By noon, the situation escalated from digital harassment to a terrifying physical reality. I looked out the front windows of our estate and saw the flash of camera lenses. 3 news vans were parked haphazardly along the street. A swarm of paparazzi and local reporters had camped directly outside our front gates, shouting questions and trying to point their lenses through the wrought iron bars. The social pressure was incredibly suffocating. I felt like the walls of my own home were closing in on me. I closed the blinds, shielding my eyes from the blinding flashes of the cameras. Dominic walked into the living room, his face a mask of cold, calculated authority. He did not panic. He simply went to war. He pulled out his phone and made a single brief call. Within 20 minutes, 3 black sport utility vehicles pulled up to our estate. A dozen highly trained private security contractors stepped out, forming an impenetrable human wall between our property line and the aggressive reporters. Dominic wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight against his chest. "I have the perimeter completely locked down," he murmured softly. "No one is getting anywhere near you or Miles. Kendrick is doing the same for Nicole at the boutique. The school has been notified and Miles will stay home today. You are safe, Cassidy." I leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his unshakable presence. My parents thought they could break me by turning the world against me. They thought the immense pressure of public hatred would force me to surrender, to drop my defenses, and to hand Preston the $5 million he demanded. They completely underestimated my resolve. I was not going to hide and cry. I was going to finish this. I pulled away from Dominic, my mind shifting into absolute razor-sharp focus. "Keep the press outside," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "I am going to my office. Do not let anyone disturb me." I walked down the hall and locked myself inside my home office. I booted up my primary workstation and activated my heavily encrypted servers. Preston thought his public relations stunt would distract me. He assumed the media circus would keep me busy playing defense. He was wrong. I pulled up the dossier Kendrick had provided the night before. I stared at the offshore routing numbers Preston had used to funnel my parents' mortgage money. I needed to know exactly why Preston was so desperate for capital right this second. He had a major tech gala approaching, yet he was hiring street thugs and filing fraudulent custody petitions just to extort $5 million from my husband. The math did not make sense for a simple failing startup. The desperation was too intense. I opened my forensic accounting software and began tracing the digital footprints of Nexus Solutions. I bypassed his superficial corporate firewalls with ease. Preston was arrogant, but his digital security was sloppy. I followed the money trail, tracing the deposits coming from his initial angel investors. I tracked the funds as they moved into his primary domestic accounts. Then I watched the money splinter. Instead of going toward software development, payroll, or actual business infrastructure, the capital was being diverted into a complex web of secondary shell companies. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I cracked the encryption on the Cayman Island holding company, registered under his mother's maiden name. The hidden ledgers finally popped onto my screen, illuminating the dark, terrifying reality of his entire operation. I analyzed the columns of incoming and outgoing wire transfers. I cross-referenced the dates of new investor deposits with the payout schedules of his earliest backers. A cold, heavy realization washed over me as the puzzle pieces snapped perfectly into place. Preston was not developing a revolutionary technology product. He was not experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. His entire business model was a carefully constructed mirage. He was taking massive amounts of money from brand new investors and secretly using those exact funds to pay fake inflated dividends to his older investors to keep them quiet. He was skimming millions off the top to fund his luxury cars, his penthouse, and his lavish lifestyle. The $5 million he tried to extort from Dominic was not meant to save a struggling company. It was a desperate last-minute bridge loan to pay off a group of angry early investors who were demanding their returns before his upcoming charity gala. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the undeniable proof displayed across my monitors. My parents had mortgaged their home to back a criminal. Preston was not just a toxic ex-husband or a failing chief executive. He was running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, and I was about to burn his entire empire to the ground. I stared at the financial records, the full scope of his criminal enterprise laid bare across my monitors. The $5 million he tried to extort from Dominic was just a drop in the bucket. He needed tens of millions to keep the illusion alive, or more accurately, to fund his absolute escape. I dug even deeper into the encrypted offshore registries, following a secondary trail of covert expenditures. The data revealed exactly what he was planning. He had already purchased a one-way, untraceable private charter flight to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty to the United States. He was planning to take the money and run, leaving everyone, including my parents, to face the devastating federal fallout. To pull off his final, ultimate heist, he needed one last massive cash injection to drain into his hidden accounts before vanishing. The very next morning, my precise suspicions were confirmed. My tablet buzzed with an alert from a prominent financial news network. Preston had just announced a spectacular charity tech gala scheduled for that exact weekend. The slick, heavily funded press release promised the exclusive unveiling of a revolutionary proprietary software algorithm that would supposedly disrupt the entire global logistics market. It was a complete, utter fabrication. There was absolutely no product in development. He was hosting a high society fundraising event disguised as a philanthropic tech launch. His ultimate goal was to collect millions in immediate seed money from brand new unsuspecting angel investors, leveraging the charity angle to make them drop their guard. He wanted them to wire their capital directly into his accounts that very night, blinded by the flashing lights and the promise of ground floor equity. But to successfully sell the monumental lie, Preston needed to look like a trustworthy, incredibly stable visionary. He needed the perfect facade of a wholesome, reliable family man to offset the vicious rumors swirling around our toxic divorce. I watched a promotional video for the upcoming gala online, and my stomach violently churned. There were Richard and Patricia dressed in custom evening wear standing proudly beside the very man who was currently stealing their entire estate. My parents were officially listed as the honorary co-chairs of the exclusive event. They were actively leveraging their decades of suburban country club social standing to personally vouch for his fake product. They were making phone calls, hosting private luncheons, and aggressively convincing their wealthy elite friends to open their checkbooks for their golden son-in-law. They truly believed they were securing their legacy. They had no idea they were acting as the lead accomplices in a federal crime that would leave them completely destitute and facing potential prison time. Preston had also taken extensive paranoid precautions to ensure I could not interfere with his grand exit strategy. I contacted Kendrick asking him to utilize his elite private security network to pull the logistical data for the upcoming event. Kendrick bypassed the venue server in a matter of minutes and forwarded me the highly classified event security manifest. My name, along with Dominic, Nicole, and Kendrick, was explicitly flagged at the absolute highest threat level. Preston had hired an independent, aggressive private security firm specifically to monitor the perimeter of the downtown luxury hotel hosting the gala. He provided them with high-resolution photographs of our faces. We were strictly banned from the premises, with explicit written orders for the armed guards to physically detain us and have us arrested for trespassing if we even stepped onto the public sidewalk outside the venue doors. Preston thought he had created a completely impenetrable fortress. He genuinely believed he could execute his final scam, rob the city elite entirely blind, and vanish into the night, while my parents took the inevitable catastrophic fall. He was banking on my inability to breach the gala to guarantee his safe passage out of the country. I sat back in my leather chair, feeling a cold, heavily calculating resolve wash over me. I printed the definitive proof of the massive Ponzi scheme, the fake software shell companies, and the offshore flight receipts. I placed the devastating documents into a sleek black folder and walked out of my home office to find my husband. Dominic was standing in the center of our living room, calmly adjusting the silver cufflinks of a tailored midnight blue suit. He looked up as I approached his dark eyes, assessing the fierce determination radiating from my posture. I handed him the thick folder, quickly explaining Preston's grand escape plan, the fabricated software product, and the heavily armed, impenetrable security perimeter he had established at the downtown luxury hotel to keep us locked out of the gala. I finished my explanation, expecting Dominic to immediately call his legal team to file an emergency injunction or contact federal authorities to raid the building before the event even started. Instead, Dominic did not look worried in the slightest. A slow, terrifyingly powerful smile spread across his handsome face. The kind of smile that made rival chief executives physically tremble in corporate boardrooms. He casually tossed the damning folder onto the glass coffee table and pulled me into a firm, confident embrace. He pressed a gentle kiss to my temple, his demeanor entirely unbothered by the heavily armed guards waiting to arrest us. "Let his little security team try to stop us," Dominic said smoothly, his deep voice vibrating with absolute, uncontested authority. I had my primary holding company quietly purchase that exact hotel 3 days ago. The deed transferred this morning. We are not going to his little charity gala as guests, Cassidy. We are walking through those front doors as the owners. The downtown luxury hotel was a monument to staggering opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the grand ballroom, illuminating a sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns. The Charity Tech Gala was in full swing, and from the outside it looked like the premier high society event of the decade. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. A soft jazz quartet played perfectly in the background. It was a flawless, dazzling illusion designed specifically to separate wealthy investors from their capital. At the center of the room, Preston was absolutely in his element. He stood near a towering ice sculpture, holding court with a group of older, deeply wealthy angel investors. He flashed his signature charismatic smile, gesturing enthusiastically as he spun lies about his revolutionary new logistics algorithm. He spoke about global disruption and philanthropic impact, weaving a masterful web of deceit. He was practically vibrating with toxic confidence, firmly believing his private flight to a non-extradition country was just hours away from departure. Hovering right beside him were my parents. Richard and Patricia looked like they had finally achieved their lifelong dream of aristocratic royalty. My mother wore a heavily beaded silver gown, clutching a glass of expensive champagne, as she laughed loudly at everything Preston said. My father stood with his chest puffed out proudly, introducing himself to the city elite as the honorary co-chair of the evening and the primary backer of his visionary son-in-law. They were oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on the grave of their own financial ruin. Outside the ballroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. Dominic, Kendrick, Nicole, and I stepped through the grand glass doors of the hotel lobby. There was no hesitation in our movements. Dominic wore a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders, perfectly radiating the cold, untouchable authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed. I walked beside him in a sweeping emerald green gown, my posture rigid with absolute resolve. Nicole looked fierce and elegant in a dark crimson dress, her arm linked with Kendrick. My brother-in-law wore a sharp-tailored suit that barely concealed the lethal coiled energy of a former federal agent ready for a takedown. We did not stop at the velvet ropes. We did not check in at the guest registry desk. As we walked through the lobby, the hotel staff immediately stepped aside, lowering their heads in silent deference. The aggressive, independent private security team that Preston had hired to guard the perimeter did not even blink as we bypassed the metal barricades. Preston had given them high-resolution photographs of our faces with strict orders to arrest us on sight. Instead, the heavily armed men simply opened the heavy mahogany doors of the main ballroom for us, granting us total unimpeded access. We stepped onto the plush carpet of the gala. I immediately locked eyes with Preston across the crowded room. He was in the middle of shaking an investor's hand when his gaze caught mine. The charismatic smile froze instantly on his face. The champagne flute in his hand tilted, spilling a few drops of expensive liquor onto his polished shoes. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the golden chandelier light. For a fraction of a second, genuine terror flashed in his eyes. He could not comprehend how the four people he had explicitly banned from the premises had effortlessly breached his impenetrable fortress. The terror quickly vanished, replaced by a hot, arrogant, venomous rage. Preston slammed his glass down on a passing waiter's tray and abruptly excused himself from the group of wealthy venture capitalists. He marched aggressively across the marble dance floor, his jaw clenched tight. Richard and Patricia noticed his sudden departure. They followed his line of sight, spotted me standing with Dominic, and immediately trailed behind Preston like loyal, panicked henchmen. Preston stopped 2 feet in front of us, physically blocking our path into the main reception area. He kept his voice lowered to a harsh, forced whisper, desperately trying to avoid causing a public scene in front of his new financial targets. "How did you get in here?" Preston hissed, his eyes darting frantically between me and the main entrance. "I gave the security detail strict written orders to detain you. You are trespassing at a private closed event. I will have you all thrown in a holding cell." Patricia stepped up right behind him, glaring at Nicole and me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "What is wrong with you two?" my mother hissed, adjusting her silver shawl defensively. "We are hosting a major philanthropic event to secure this family a lasting legacy. You are deliberately trying to ruin a charitable evening out of pure, bitter jealousy. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Richard pointed a trembling finger at Dominic. I told you before to stay out of our business. You liquidators think you can just walk into any building and throw your weight around. Not tonight. You have absolutely no power here. Preston smirked, his toxic bravado returning in full force, as he realized no one else in the ballroom had noticed the confrontation yet. He snapped his fingers sharply in the air, signaling the tactical security team he had paid a massive premium to employ. I warned you to stay away, Cassidy, Preston growled, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with a sickening look of triumph. But since you want to play games, I am going to let my guards physically drag you and your little entourage out by your hair. Let the paparazzi outside take pictures of you getting thrown onto the wet pavement. The burly head of security, a towering man wearing a tactical earpiece, marched briskly across the room toward our group. 2 other armed guards flanked him. Preston took a step back, gesturing dramatically toward us. Remove them, Preston ordered the imposing guard, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. Use whatever physical force is necessary. They are trespassing. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just smiled coldly at the man who thought he had finally won. The head of security stopped directly in front of Preston. He looked at my ex-husband with a completely blank, unbothered expression. Then the heavily armed guard turned his back on Preston entirely. He faced Dominic, bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect, and folded his hands behind his back. Everything is completely secure, boss, the head of security stated clearly, his voice carrying over the soft jazz music. The perimeter is locked down on your orders. Preston stopped breathing. His smug, triumphant smile shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He stared at the guard, then looked at Dominic, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality crashing down on him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had no power here. He had no authority. The very ground he was standing on belonged entirely to the man he had just tried to extort. The realization paralyzed Preston for 3 agonizing seconds. He stared at Dominic, his mouth opening and closing as the catastrophic truth set in. He had no power here. He had no authority. The very ground he was standing on belonged entirely to the man he had just tried to extort. Survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding his shattered ego. Preston spun around, completely abandoning the confrontation. He knew he could not force us out, but he still had a room full of wealthy targets. If he could just secure the wire transfers right now, he could still make his private flight and vanish before the authorities were called. He practically sprinted toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. He grabbed a microphone from a bewildered event coordinator and signaled for the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, Preston announced, his voice carrying a frantic, desperate pitch that echoed over the speakers. We are moving our schedule up. The future of global commerce cannot wait. The jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. The elite investors turned their attention to the stage, murmuring in surprise. Richard and Patricia exchanged confused glances, but my mother quickly plastered on a supportive smile, clapping her hands to encourage the crowd. While Preston commanded the room, I did not stay to listen. I turned to Dominic and gave him a single nod. He and Nicole remained planted firmly on the marble dance floor, holding the attention of the security guards. Kendrick fell into step right behind me as I slipped quietly through the side service doors. We moved swiftly up the carpeted back staircase toward the audiovisual control booth that hovered directly over the grand ballroom. The lone technician sitting behind the massive soundboard jumped up as we entered the dimly lit booth. Excuse me, you cannot be in here, the technician stammered. Kendrick stepped forward, utilizing his massive frame to block the doorway. He flashed a heavy silver badge from his private security firm. Facility inspection, Kendrick said in a tone that broke absolutely no argument. Take a 5-minute coffee break, now. The technician took one look at Kendrick's unyielding expression and immediately scurried out the door. I stepped up to the main projection console. Through the soundproof glass window, I had a perfect bird's-eye view of Preston pacing aggressively across the stage. Sweat was visibly beading on his forehead under the harsh stage lights. He was talking a mile a minute, throwing out meaningless tech buzzwords and promising impossible returns on investment. The global logistics market is ripe for disruption, Preston shouted into the microphone, his eyes darting nervously toward the ballroom doors. But this exclusive equity window closes tonight. Our proprietary algorithm is ready for deployment. I am asking you to open your portfolios and wire your seed capital immediately. Those who initiate their transfers in the next 10 minutes will secure premium ground floor shares before we go public. It was a pathetic, transparent display of absolute desperation. He was literally begging them to hand over their money so he could flee the country. I pulled the encrypted hard drive from my clutch. I bypassed the venue's superficial presentation software and plugged my drive directly into the master projection mainframe. Down on the stage, Preston spread his arms wide, building toward his grand crescendo. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to direct your attention to the main screen. Behold the product that will secure your financial legacy. I placed my finger over the enter key. This is for Miles, I whispered to myself. I pressed the key down hard. The massive digital screen behind Preston did not display a sleek modern technology logo. It did not show a revolutionary software interface. The screen flashed stark white, then snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. Projected 50 feet wide across the front of the ballroom were Preston's raw, unedited offshore bank statements. Preston kept his arms raised, smiling widely at the audience, completely unaware of the devastating financial truth looming right behind his head. I worked the control board with clinical precision. I zoomed in on the first highly incriminating column of data. The entire ballroom fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Hundreds of wealthy angel investors stopped breathing. They stared at the giant screen, their experienced financial eyes instantly recognizing the pattern of a massive corporate fraud. The screen highlighted a $2 million deposit from a prominent venture capital firm in the front row. Immediately below it, a bright red digital marker traced that exact $2 million being wired directly to a luxury marine broker in Monaco for the purchase of a private yacht. Preston finally noticed the dead silence in the room. His smile faltered. He slowly turned around to look at the screen. The microphone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the wooden stage with a loud, piercing screech of feedback. I did not stop. I clicked to the next slide, mirroring the hidden Cayman Island shell accounts for the entire city elite to see. The red highlighter dragged across the screen in real time, exposing how Preston was systematically taking deposits from new investors and using those exact funds to pay fake dividends to his early backers. It was the undeniable mathematical blueprint of a textbook Ponzi scheme. Then I brought up the final, most devastating document. I projected the wire transfer logs directly alongside the fraudulent second mortgage documents. The screen lit up with the names Richard and Patricia. A massive, glaring red circle highlighted the $750,000 my parents had wired him just days ago. Next to it, the ledger showed that exact sum being instantly drained to pay off Preston's personal gambling debts and the deposit on his untraceable flight out of the country. Down in the audience, my mother let out a sharp, horrifying gasp. She stumbled backward, clutching her chest as the reality of the giant numbers hit her. My father turned the color of ash, staring up at the screen as his entire life savings, his pristine estate, and his precious social standing completely evaporated in front of his country club friends. The entire ballroom watched in dead silence as the undeniable proof of his crimes burned brightly under the chandeliers. Preston was exposed. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom lasted for perhaps 10 agonizing seconds. It was the collective breathless pause of hundreds of highly educated financial minds simultaneously processing a catastrophic reality. Then the polished aristocratic decorum of the city elite completely vanished. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave and absolute chaos erupted. A prominent venture capitalist standing in the front row hurled his crystal champagne flute directly at the stage. It shattered violently against the wooden podium, the sharp sound snapping the crowd out of their paralyzed trance. Instantly, the ballroom devolved into a frenzied mob. Wealthy investors began screaming, their faces red with sheer outrage. Men in tailored tuxedos shoved past the cocktail tables, storming toward the stage with their phones already pressed to their ears, frantically dialing their corporate attorneys and federal regulators. Preston stood frozen under the harsh, blinding stage lights. He desperately scooped up the dropped microphone, fumbling with the power switch. He raised his hands, trying to project a commanding posture, but his hands were shaking so violently he looked pathetic. "Please, everyone, remain calm," Preston shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. "This is a targeted cyber attack. The data on the screen is completely fabricated. It is a malicious smear campaign. I implore you to look at the proprietary software models instead." Nobody was listening. The digital evidence, blazing 50 feet wide across the screen, was entirely too precise, too deeply detailed to be faked. The crowd surged forward. The furious shouts echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, demanding immediate wire reversals and threatening massive multi-million-dollar lawsuits. I stood safely behind the soundproof glass of the audio-visual control booth, looking down at the absolute destruction of his empire. My eyes bypassed the screaming investors and locked directly onto my parents. Richard and Patricia had not moved a single inch. They stood perfectly still near the center of the dance floor, staring up at the giant projection. The glaring red circle highlighting their $750,000 mortgage seemed to burn directly into their retinas. The horrific realization was physically washing over them. They were not just looking at a failed business venture. They were looking at their own absolute destitution. My mother began to hyperventilate. Her hands flew to her mouth, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath in her expensive silver gown. The elite country club friends she had aggressively pressured into attending the gala were now turning on her. I watched as women who had just been praising her social grace took deliberate steps backward, looking at Patricia with a mixture of profound pity and blistering disgust. They realized my parents had acted as the primary decoys for a massive federal scam. The social standing my mother valued above her own daughters was evaporating right in front of her eyes. My father finally snapped out of his shock, his face contorted with a desperate, animalistic rage. Richard shoved his way through the angry crowd, ignoring the shouting investors, and marched directly up the side stairs onto the main stage. He grabbed Preston roughly by the lapels of his custom suit. "What is that?" Richard roared, his voice carrying even without a microphone. "What did you do with our house? You told me that money was securely escrowed for research and development. You promised us a guaranteed return. Where is our money, Preston?" Preston, stripped entirely of his charismatic golden boy facade, finally showed his true venomous colors. He did not apologize. He did not try to comfort the man who had treated him like a son. Instead, Preston forcefully shoved my father backward. Richard stumbled, his dress shoes slipping on the polished wooden stage, barely catching his balance before falling. "Get your hands off me, you gullible old fool!" Preston snarled, his voice loud enough to carry over the front rows. "You really thought a tech company was going to make you a billionaire overnight? You handed over your deed because you are greedy and obsessed with status. You practically begged me to take your money. You have nobody to blame but yourself." Patricia let out a shattered, agonizing wail from the floor below. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the plush carpet, weeping hysterically as the reality of her impending homelessness finally broke her. Richard stood on the stage, his arms hanging limply at his sides, staring at the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. The delusion was permanently shattered. They had mortgaged their home to back a monster, and the monster was currently mocking their stupidity on a brightly lit stage. I felt absolutely no pity for them. I felt no urge to rush down and comfort the people who had gladly signed perjured affidavits to help kidnap my child. I felt only the cold, satisfying weight of justice taking its natural course. I locked the projection screen interface, ensuring Preston's bank statements would loop continuously for the rest of the night. Then I turned and exited the control booth, making my way down the back stairwell to rejoin Dominic, Nicole, and Kendrick on the main floor. Back in the ballroom, Preston realized the situation was completely unsalvageable. The crowd was growing more aggressive by the second. Several investors were attempting to climb onto the stage to physically confront him. Preston glanced toward the main lobby doors, but he saw Dominic standing there like an immovable fortress surrounded by a dozen of his own highly trained security contractors blocking the primary exits. Preston's eyes darted frantically around the room, hunting for a way out. He knew the furious investors had already called the authorities. The police and likely federal agents were minutes away from swarming the luxury hotel. If he stayed on that stage, he would be arrested on the spot. He looked down at my father one last time, sneered in disgust, and then bolted. Preston abandoned his honorary family, jumping off the side of the stage. He shoved violently past a group of screaming venture capitalists, knocking a waiter to the ground in his manic desperation, and made a frantic sprint straight for the restricted service elevators hidden in the back corridor. Preston slammed his hand against the service elevator button, his chest heaving as the muffled roar of the furious crowd echoed through the walls behind him. The stainless steel doors parted and he threw himself inside, frantically jamming the button for the subterranean parking garage. The descent felt agonizingly slow. He pulled at his silk tie, struggling to draw air into his burning lungs. His perfectly constructed world was collapsing floor by floor, but his sheer arrogance refused to accept total defeat. He still had his passport tucked inside his jacket pocket. He had memorized the encrypted routing numbers for the offshore accounts. His chartered flight was fully fueled and waiting on a private tarmac just 20 miles outside the city limits. All he needed to do was reach his sports car drive out of the underground structure and disappear into the night before the local authorities could even secure a warrant. The elevator chimed a sharp metallic note. The doors slid open to reveal the dim, cavernous expanse of the hotel parking garage. The air down here was cold and smelled faintly of damp concrete and exhaust. Preston sprinted out of the elevator bay. The frantic slapping of his expensive dress shoes echoed loudly across the empty structure. He pulled his electronic key fob from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the unlock button. He rounded a thick concrete pillar and spotted his sleek black sports car parked in the designated high-security area. But as he rushed toward the vehicle, his frantic footsteps abruptly slowed to a halt. His thumb froze on the key fob. The automatic headlights flared to life, illuminating a scene that made his blood run completely cold. Kendrick was leaning casually against the hood of the luxury car. My brother-in-law had his arms crossed over his broad chest, his posture radiating the absolute relaxed confidence of an apex predator who had just successfully cornered his prey. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the grim, unyielding determination of a seasoned federal investigator. "You run surprisingly fast for a man carrying so much stolen debt," Kendrick stated, his deep voice rolling across the empty concrete garage. "But you really should have checked the structural integrity of your escape route before you decided to burn the entire building down." Preston stumbled backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the concrete exit ramps. He was trapped. He looked at Kendrick, his panic rapidly morphing into desperate bargaining desperation. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, completely abandoning the aggressive, dominant persona he had worn upstairs. "Listen to me," Preston pleaded, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "You are a smart man, Kendrick. You run a private security firm. You know how the real world works. I have millions of dollars sitting in accounts that absolutely nobody knows about except me. I can wire you $2 million right now, $3 million. Just step away from the car and let me drive out of here. You can tell Cassidy I slipped past you. You can take the money and retire tomorrow." Kendrick let out a low, terrifyingly calm laugh. He pushed himself off the hood of the sports car and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward Preston. "You really do not understand the fundamental difference between us," Kendrick replied smoothly. "You look at people and only see price tags. You looked at my sister-in-law and saw a convenient scapegoat. You looked at her vulnerable parents and saw a free mortgage to fund your pathetic vanity. You think everybody has a price because your own loyalty can be bought for pennies." Preston swallowed hard, taking another step back. "I am offering you generational wealth," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Kendrick. "Cassidy and Dominic do not even need to know. You can take the cash and secure your own family. Do not be a self-righteous fool." "My family is already secure," Kendrick countered, his voice dropping to a lethal, unwavering register. Because I protect them from parasites like you. I did not just come down here to stop you from driving away Preston. I came down here to watch the exact moment you realize you have absolutely nothing left. Preston clenched his fists, a wild, cornered look flashing in his eyes. He realized diplomacy was failing. He calculated the distance to the exit ramp, weighing his chances of physically overpowering the towering former agent and making a run for the street. He shifted his weight, preparing to launch a desperate attack. Kendrick simply tilted his head, reading the pathetic, tactical assessment in Preston's eyes. I highly recommend you do not try that, Kendrick warned softly. I spent 10 years taking down violent racketeering syndicates. If you take one aggressive step toward me, I will consider it a hostile threat, and I will thoroughly enjoy restraining you. Preston froze, his brief surge of adrenaline completely evaporating. He was entirely out of options. He stood shivering in his tailored tuxedo, the crushing reality of his situation finally breaking his spirit. He had no money, no leverage, and no escape. You cannot just keep me down here, Preston whined, his voice shrinking into a pathetic whimper. The local police cannot hold me without a verified warrant. I have legal rights. Kendrick calmly lifted his wrist and checked his watch. You are absolutely right, he agreed casually. The local police would need time to sort through jurisdiction and secure the proper warrants for a financial crime of this magnitude. It is a very tedious process. That is precisely why my wife and I skipped the local precinct entirely. A sudden, piercing screech of heavy tires echoed loudly down the concrete ramp. Preston whipped his head around, his eyes widening in absolute terror. Bright, blinding flashes of red and blue lights suddenly flooded the dim parking garage. The vibrant colors bounced violently off the concrete walls and the shiny surface of Preston's sports car. 3 black, unmarked sport utility vehicles and 4 heavily armored police cruisers completely barricaded the only exit ramp. The vehicles parked at sharp, aggressive angles, entirely blocking any possible route of escape. Kendrick took a deliberate step backward, creating space between himself and the target. I forwarded the entire decrypted ledger of your Cayman Island accounts directly to my former supervisor at the Federal Bureau of Investigation 4 hours ago, Kendrick stated, his voice completely devoid of mercy. They were just waiting for you to attempt to flee the jurisdiction to finalize the conspiracy charges. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing tactical vests swarmed into the garage. Their heavy boots pounded against the pavement as they rapidly closed the distance. They moved with absolute synchronized precision, shouting loud commanding orders that echoed fiercely through the underground chamber. Preston let out a shattered, agonizing cry. He did not fight back. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the federal task force completely broke him. Kendrick simply stepped aside and watched the execution of justice unfold. 2 federal agents grabbed Preston roughly by the shoulders, shoving him face first against the sleek hood of his own luxury sports car. The harsh, metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking securely around Preston's wrists echoed loudly in the damp air. He was forcefully detained in his custom tuxedo, his face pressed against the cold metal, weeping uncontrollably as the agents read him his rights. His fraudulent empire was officially undeniably dead. 3 days passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the concrete walls of that underground parking garage. The swift, brutal efficiency of the federal justice system had completely dismantled Preston's entire life. I sat at the expansive mahogany desk in my downtown corporate office, sipping a hot espresso while watching the morning financial news broadcast on the wall monitor. The spectacular collapse of Nexus Solutions was the only topic financial analysts wanted to discuss. Preston had faced his initial arraignment hearing the previous afternoon. His high-priced defense attorney had tried to argue for house arrest, citing his client's lack of violent criminal history. The federal judge holding the meticulously detailed offshore ledger Kendrick had provided shut the request down instantly. The judge deemed Preston an extreme flight risk, pointing out the previously chartered private jet and the unextradited destination. Bail was categorically denied. Preston was sent directly back to a federal holding facility, trading his bespoke tailored tuxedo for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Simultaneously, federal regulators executed a total uncompromising freeze on every single asset connected to his name. The Cayman Island shell corporations were seized, the luxury sports cars were impounded, the multi-million-dollar penthouse was padlocked with a federal seizure notice pasted directly onto the front door. Preston had absolutely nothing left, not even a single dime to pay his legal team. The mirage he had spent years building evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a massive crater of debt and ruined lives. Unfortunately for my parents, that crater was situated directly underneath their sprawling, pristine suburban estate. While I watched the news from the secure comfort of my office, a very different scene was unfolding miles away in the affluent neighborhood where I grew up. According to the perimeter security updates, Kendrick was monitoring the harsh reality of corporate fraud had finally reached Richard and Patricia's front doorstep. My parents had spent the last 3 days hiding inside their massive house, refusing to answer calls from their furious country club friends who had lost millions investing in Preston's fake algorithm. They genuinely believed the storm would eventually pass. They assumed their wealth and social standing would somehow insulate them from the catastrophic legal fallout. They were entirely wrong. At precisely 9 in the morning, a fleet of dark sedans pulled up to their manicured driveway. It was not the local police checking in. It was a highly coordinated team of federal asset liquidators, accompanied by senior representatives from their primary lending bank. Richard opened the heavy oak door, his face pale and drawn from sleep deprivation, only to be handed a stack of devastating legal documents. The lead bank representative informed him that the $750,000 second mortgage they had taken out was intrinsically tied to an active federal money laundering investigation. Because my parents had knowingly wired that massive sum directly into a fraudulent corporate account, they had violated the core terms of their lending agreement. The bank was not going to wait for a standard foreclosure process. To protect their institutional assets from federal seizure, the bank was exercising an immediate emergency repossession of the collateral. My parents were given exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings could fit into a few suitcases. They were ordered to vacate the premises immediately. Patricia collapsed onto the foyer staircase, weeping hysterically, as agents began cataloging the expensive artwork and antique furniture that no longer belonged to her. She begged the bank representatives for an extension, citing her standing in the community and her decades of loyal patronage. Her elite entitlement fell on completely deaf ears. Financial institutions do not care about country club memberships when federal indictments are involved. Richard tried to make frantic phone calls to his wealthy golfing buddies, seeking a massive emergency loan to stop the seizure. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The very people they had tried to impress had firmly locked them out. Their entire social circle recognized them as the primary decoys who had lured unsuspecting friends into a devastating scam. They were absolute pariahs. By 11 o'clock, Richard and Patricia found themselves standing on the wet pavement outside the heavy iron gates of their former estate. They watched in absolute crushing horror as heavy chains and commercial padlocks were wrapped securely around the front doors. Their luxury cars had been repossessed by the bank. They stood in the damp autumn air with nothing but 3 rolling suitcases shivering as their neighbors drove slowly past, openly staring at the spectacular public disgrace. They had no home, they had no money. Their credit was completely destroyed, and their golden son-in-law was locked inside a concrete federal cell facing decades in prison. They had sacrificed their own daughter to protect an illusion, and the illusion had just left them utterly destitute. Standing on the curb, shivering in her damp designer coat, Patricia turned to Richard with a look of frantic, wild desperation. They had completely run out of options. They could not afford a hotel, and nobody in their pristine neighborhood was going to offer them a guest bedroom. There was only one person left in the entire city with the financial power to save them. They swallowed the last remaining shreds of their toxic pride, hailed a rideshare service with the final few dollars in their checking account, and headed straight for the downtown financial district. I was in the middle of reviewing a new client portfolio when the intercom on my desk buzzed sharply. My executive assistant sounded incredibly tense. "Cassidy, I am so sorry to interrupt your workflow, but there is a severe situation in the main lobby. Your parents are here. They bypassed the lower security desk by tailgating a delivery courier. They are demanding to see you immediately, and they are refusing to leave the premises until you grant them an audience. I sat back in my leather chair, a cold, unyielding resolve settling deeply into my bones. The final confrontation had officially arrived. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite flew open before my assistant could even formally announce them. Richard and Patricia stumbled into my office dragging 3 wet, scuffed rolling suitcases across my pristine white carpeting. The visual contrast was staggering. For my entire life, my parents had been the absolute epitome of suburban country club perfection. They wore custom-tailored golf attire, drove leased luxury sedans, and looked down their noses at anyone who earned less than $1 million a year. Today, they looked utterly destroyed. The relentless morning rain had ruined Patricia's expensive blowout. Her hair hung in wet, stringy clumps around her face, and her mascara was smeared in dark streaks down her cheeks. Richard looked completely hollowed out. His posture, usually puffed up with toxic arrogance, had completely collapsed. He was gripping the handle of his suitcase so tightly his knuckles were stark white. They stood in the center of my spacious office, shivering, looking wildly around at the modern art and the panoramic view of the financial district. "Cassidy," my mother wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. She dropped the handle of her suitcase and rushed forward, throwing her hands flat onto my mahogany desk. "You have to help us. We have absolutely nowhere to go. The bank locked us out. They took everything. They even took my jewelry boxes and your father's vintage watches." I did not stand up. I did not offer them a tissue, a cup of coffee, or a single shred of comfort. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly over a stack of client files, watching the spectacular collapse of their lifelong delusions. Richard stepped up beside her, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Preston lied to us." My father gasped, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. "That monster completely deceived us. We thought he was a visionary. We thought he was building a legacy for this family, but he was a criminal. He stole our money and ruined our good name. You have to call Dominic right now. Tell your husband to contact the federal liquidators. He has billions of dollars, Cassidy. He can easily wire a few million to the bank and buy our estate back today. We can put this whole ugly nightmare behind us." The sheer unadulterated audacity of their demands actually made me smile. It was a cold, humorless expression that made my father physically flinch. They had not come here to apologize for mortgaging their home to fund the man who abused me. They had not come to beg forgiveness for signing perjured affidavits to help Preston kidnap my 6-year-old son. They had come here expecting me to act as their personal automated teller machine simply because their golden boy had finally been locked in a federal cage. "I am not calling my husband," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "And Dominic is certainly not buying your house back. You made a profoundly stupid investment with a known con artist. Now you get to experience the consequences." Patricia slammed her hands against the desk again, her fake sorrow instantly evaporating into shrill, entitled rage. "How can you be so incredibly selfish?" she screamed, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you in a beautiful home and provided for you. You owe us your loyalty. You cannot just sit up here in this glass tower and watch us become homeless. What will our friends think? What will the community say?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with the woman who had spent my entire 30 years on this earth, making me feel completely worthless. "Your friends already know exactly what you did," I replied smoothly. "They know you acted as the primary decoys for a massive Ponzi scheme. Nobody in your pristine little suburb is ever going to speak to you again. And as for owing you my loyalty, I think you severely overestimate your position. You lost the right to call yourselves my parents the day you threw me out on the street while I was pregnant." Richard slammed his fist against the back of a leather guest chair. "That is ancient history, Cassidy. We are talking about right now. We made a mistake trusting Preston, yes, but we are family. Family protects each other when things go wrong. You have to forgive us. You are our daughter. You are supposed to honor your mother and father." He was playing the only card he had left. He was banking on the old, deeply ingrained trauma bond. For years, I had been the desperate, eager to please scapegoat who would have done absolutely anything to earn a single word of validation from them. They expected me to revert to that broken girl. They thought my craving for parental approval would override the fact that they had actively tried to destroy my life just a few days ago. Family protects each other. I repeated, testing the words on my tongue. Is that what you were doing when you went on a live morning television show and told millions of viewers that I was a money-hungry monster? Was that familial protection? We were tricked, Patricia sobbed, reaching out as if to grab my hand. I pulled my arms back, refusing her touch. Preston manipulated us. He told us you were trying to ruin him out of jealousy. He made us sign those custody papers. We did not know what they really said. We were just trying to help him secure a relationship with his son. Miles is not his son, I fired back, my voice rising with lethal precision. And you knew exactly what those papers said. You read them, and you signed them in front of a notary. You committed federal perjury to help a monster steal a child that does not share a single drop of his blood. You did it because he threatened to let the bank take your precious house if you refused. You chose your real estate over my child. The truth hung heavy and suffocating in the air between us. They had no defense. There was no excuse or manipulation left to deploy. They stood in the center of my office, shivering in their damp clothes, completely stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their power. "Please, Cassidy," my father whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, broken sob. "We have $20 in our checking account. We do not even have money for a motel room tonight. If you do not help us, we are going to be sleeping on the street. You cannot do this to us." I looked at the two people who had caused me so much agony. I felt no pity. I felt no obligation. I opened the deep bottom drawer of my mahogany desk. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, worn, leather-bound ledger. I placed it squarely on the center of the desk. "You are right about one thing," I said quietly, resting my hand on the cracked leather cover. "We need to talk about exactly what I owe you. I have kept this specific ledger since the day I turned 18. I think it is finally time we review the balance." I flipped open the heavy cover of the leather-bound ledger. The spine cracked softly in the quiet office. Richard leaned forward, his eyes darting to the pages, likely expecting to see a list of my offshore investment accounts or a catalog of liquid assets I could immediately transfer to his failing bank. Patricia stopped crying for a fraction of a second, a pathetic glimmer of hope washing over her tear-stained face. They genuinely believed I was about to calculate their bailout. Instead, I ran my index finger down the very first column of faded ink. "Let us start at the beginning," I said, my voice projecting a calm, clinical detachment. "August 14th, 12 years ago. I asked for a $500 loan to buy textbooks for my freshman accounting classes. You told me you could not spare the cash because you were upgrading the landscaping around your swimming pool. I worked 3 minimum wage shifts a week to pay for my own education." Richard blinked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Cassidy, what is the point of bringing up ancient history? We are facing a financial catastrophe right now." I ignored him and turned the page. March 3rd, 6 years ago. The exact day Preston demanded I terminate my pregnancy and threw me out of our apartment. I stood on your front porch in the freezing rain with a single trash bag of my clothes. I begged you for a place to sleep. You locked the door and told me to go back and apologize to him because you were hosting a country club mixer that evening and did not want my drama ruining your appetizers. Patricia swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "We thought you were just having a typical marital dispute. We wanted you to work it out." I turned another page, the sound slicing through their pathetic excuses. 2 days later. I asked to borrow $200 for groceries and prenatal vitamins. You told me I was a financial burden. Yet according to the bank statements I reviewed this morning, you gifted Preston $10,000 that exact same week to help him buy a new luxury watch to celebrate his promotion. I closed the ledger with a loud final thud. I owed you absolutely nothing when I was 18, and I owe you even less today. But my documentation does not stop with financial neglect. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a crisp, freshly printed sheet of paper. I slid it across the mahogany desk, stopping it right next to my parents' shivering, desperate hands. It was a certified transcription of a television broadcast. Let us review your most recent contribution to my life, I continued, leaning back in my chair. Yesterday morning at 8:15. You sat on the couches of a live local morning show. You looked directly into a broadcast camera and spoke to millions of viewers. I am going to read your exact words, so we are perfectly clear on where we stand. I picked up my own copy of the transcript and read aloud, making sure every syllable hit them like a physical blow. Our daughter Cassidy married a ruthless billionaire, and the money completely changed her. She has turned into a cold, greedy monster. She is keeping little Miles away from his loving father Preston, and she has completely abandoned us. I set the paper down and looked my mother dead in the eye. You went on television and called me a cold, greedy monster to protect a man who was actively laundering your mortgage money. You tried to destroy my business, my marriage, and my right to protect my own son. You did all of this willingly. Richard slammed his hands against his thighs, his face twisting into a mask of desperate anger. We were conned. Preston fed us those lines. He told us if we went on television and pressured you, he would guarantee our return on investment. We were trying to save our home. You have to understand the pressure we were under. I understand perfectly, I replied smoothly. You value your real estate more than your own flesh and blood. You always have. Which brings me to my final point of business today. I opened my top drawer and pulled out a glossy, high-definition real estate brochure along with a thick stack of finalized closing documents. I placed them on the desk. The cover of the brochure featured a stunning, sprawling 5-bedroom estate nestled behind heavy iron gates in one of the most exclusive, highly secure neighborhoods in the entire city. It had a massive wraparound porch, a beautiful garden, and state-of-the-art security systems. Patricia gasped, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. She reached out with a trembling hand, lightly touching the glossy photograph of the grand entryway. Her tears of despair instantly transformed into tears of overwhelming, greedy joy. "Oh, Cassidy!" Patricia wept, a frantic smile breaking across her face. "I knew you would not let us fall. I knew you still loved us. This house is absolutely gorgeous. It is even better than our old estate. We can move our things in today. Thank you. We promise we will make this up to you." Richard let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He actually chuckled, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You really had us going for a minute there, Cassidy. You made your point. We learned our lesson. Now who do we speak to about getting the keys to the property?" I reached out and firmly pulled the brochure away from Patricia's greedy fingertips. "You misunderstand," I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute freezing ice. "I did buy this house in cash yesterday afternoon. The deed is fully cleared and the security team is already on site, but this house is not for you." The smiles vanished from their faces instantly. Richard stared at me, his jaw slacking. "Then who is it for?" "It is for Nicole and Kendrick," I stated clearly. Yesterday morning, Preston hired violent street thugs to destroy my sister's boutique simply because she refused to abandon me. Kendrick spent last night hunting down those criminals to protect my family. Nicole and Kendrick have stood by me, defended me, and loved me when you threw me to the wolves. They are my family. I bought this estate to ensure they always have a safe, impenetrable fortress. You two are getting absolutely nothing." Patricia let out a horrified, agonizing shriek. "You cannot do this. You are giving a multi-million-dollar estate to that hired muscle while your own parents sleep on the street. You vindictive, evil little girl." Richard lunged forward, grabbing the edge of my desk, as if he wanted to flip it over. "I will sue you. I will take you to court for elder neglect. I will ruin you." I did not even blink. I reached out and pressed a sleek silver button on my desk console. Instantly, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. 4 massive, heavily armed corporate security guards stepped into the room. They moved with swift, tactical precision, grabbing my parents by their arms and pulling them forcefully away from my desk. Richard thrashed against the guards. Patricia screamed hysterically, her designer shoes slipping on the carpet as they dragged her backward toward her pathetic rolling suitcases. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I looked my parents dead in their terrified, desperate eyes. "You made your choices." I said, my voice echoing with total finality. You backed a criminal, you sold out your grandson, and you lost everything. We are not family. As of this exact second, you are officially strangers. Remove them from my building. The guards hauled them out of the executive suite, their frantic screams fading down the corridor until the heavy glass doors sealed shut, leaving me in absolute triumphant silence. 6 months passed since the heavy glass doors of my executive suite sealed shut on my parents. The absolute silence in my office that day became the permanent, unshakable new baseline for my entire life. There were no more toxic phone calls. There were no more manipulative guilt trips or frantic demands for money. There was just absolute, uninterrupted peace within my own home, but the outside world was anything but quiet. Preston's massive federal fraud trial had finally arrived, and the downtown courthouse had been transformed into an absolute media circus. News vans wrapped around the entire city block. Aggressive reporters camped out on the concrete steps, microphones ready to capture the ultimate downfall of the tech visionary who robbed the city elite blind. I walked through the metal detectors escorted by Dominic and Kendrick, flanked by our private security detail. The flashing cameras reflected off the polished marble floors of the courthouse lobby, tracking our every movement. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. I took my seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. Preston sat just a few feet away at the defense desk. The visual transformation of my ex-husband was completely staggering. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive was entirely gone. His sharp jawline was covered in patchy, unkempt stubble. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his defense team, his shoulders hunched forward in a posture of total defeat. He refused to look in my direction. For 2 relentless weeks, the trial dominated the financial news networks. Preston's defense attorney attempted a desperate, pathetic strategy. They tried to argue that Preston was simply an ambitious entrepreneur who got in slightly over his head. They claimed the missing millions were the result of complex international tax laws and rogue, incompetent accountants who mismanaged the startup capital without Preston's direct knowledge. It was a cowardly attempt to throw his own financial team under the bus just to save his own skin. But the prosecution had a silver bullet, and I had personally handed it to them. When the lead federal prosecutor called his star financial witness to the stand, he did not just bring a standard banking ledger. He brought my fully decrypted, deeply analyzed forensic accounting report. The exact report I had compiled on the very day my parents tried to destroy my reputation on live television. The prosecution projected my financial matrix onto the large courtroom monitors. It was the precise presentation I had used to crash his fake charity gala, but now it was backed by the full, unrelenting power of the federal government. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the undeniable digital footprint of Preston's Ponzi scheme. He showed the exact timestamps of the wire transfers. He proved that Preston personally authorized the movement of funds into the Cayman Island Shell Corporation registered under his mother's maiden name. There was no rogue accountant. There was only Preston consciously and deliberately stealing millions of dollars to fund his luxury lifestyle and his planned escape to a non-extradition country. The defense completely crumbled. The physical evidence was entirely insurmountable. But while the jury watched the damning numbers light up the screens, my attention briefly drifted to the back of the courtroom gallery. Sitting in the very last row, completely isolated from the rest of the spectators, were Richard and Patricia. I almost did not recognize my own parents. The rapid, brutal aging they had endured over the last 6 months was shocking. My mother's perfectly highlighted blonde hair had gone entirely gray at the roots. She wore a faded, off-the-rack beige sweater that looked like it came from a discount department store. My father looked frail and defeated, his posture caved in, staring blankly at the scuffed wooden floorboards. They had lost their sprawling suburban estate, their luxury cars, and their pristine country club memberships. But the most crushing blow for them was the absolute loss of their social relevance. When they walked into the courthouse that morning, the aggressive paparazzi and local reporters had completely ignored them. The press shoved right past my parents to get photos of the wealthy investors and the federal prosecutors. Worse, The former friends sitting a few rows ahead of them actively turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact. Richard and Patricia were no longer the elite influential society members they had spent their entire lives pretending to be. They were just two broke, gullible senior citizens who had fallen for a scam. They were completely invisible. I turned my eyes back to the front of the room, feeling absolutely no pity. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood up to read the verdict, the tension in the room spiked. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, securities, fraud, money laundering, and federal conspiracy. Preston physically collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals who preyed on vulnerable investors, did not mince his words during sentencing. He looked down from the bench with blistering contempt. "You built an empire on lies, arrogance, and the financial ruin of others," the judge stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You used a fake charity event to extort good people, and you attempted to flee justice like a coward. For your crimes, I sentence you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." The strike of the wooden gavel sounded like a cannon shot. Two federal marshals immediately grabbed Preston by the arms, hauling him up from the defense table. They slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. He looked back over his shoulder one last time as they dragged him toward the side-holding cell. His eyes met mine, filled with absolute crushing despair. I gave him a slow, cold smile, watching the heavy metal doors slam shut behind him forever. The courtroom erupted into relieved murmurs as the gallery began to clear out. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I did not look back at the last row where my former parents sat weeping into their cheap tissues. They were simply strangers in a crowded room. I walked down the center aisle, pushing open the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom. I walked past the flashing cameras in the lobby, declining to give a statement to the shouting reporters. I stepped through the main entrance of the courthouse and out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. Standing at the bottom of the wide concrete steps, completely separated from the toxic chaos of the past, was my real family. Dominic stood tall and proud, holding little Miles in his arms. Nicole and Kendrick stood right beside them, beaming with profound joy. I walked down the steps toward the people who had protected me, ready to finally go home. I walked down the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse, leaving the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters far behind me. Dominic met me at the bottom, his strong arms wrapping around me in a fiercely protective embrace. Miles giggled, reaching out to tug on my coat, while Nicole and Kendrick smiled with profound relief. We climbed into the waiting black sport utility vehicle, the heavy doors sealing shut, finally blocking out the noise of the media circus. I looked at the people sitting inside that car, with me realizing the war was officially over. I was finally truly going home. 3 months later, the crisp, biting chill of late November settled over our sprawling, peaceful estate. It was Thanksgiving Day. For the first time in my entire 30 years of life, the holiday did not fill me with a suffocating sense of dread. There was no walking on eggshells. There was no bracing for my mother's passive-aggressive critiques about my career, and there was no listening to my father brag about whatever fraudulent venture Preston was running. The massive, beautiful house Dominic and I shared was filled only with the rich, savory scent of roasted turkey, the crackle of a warm fireplace, and the sound of genuine, unburdened laughter. While I stood in my custom chef's kitchen pouring a glass of fine red wine, I took a fleeting moment to think about the people who had tried to destroy me. I imagined Preston sitting in his stark, freezing concrete cell in the maximum security federal penitentiary. The harsh reality of his 15-year sentence had undoubtedly set in. He had no tailored suits, no luxury sports cars, and no stage to project his fake algorithms. The charismatic, arrogant chief executive was entirely gone, replaced by just another federal inmate stripped of his name and assigned a permanent identification number. He was trapped in a cage with no wealthy investors to manipulate and absolutely no leverage left to exploit. His entire existence had been built on feeding his colossal ego, and now he was deprived of an audience. He had decades to stare at a cinderblock wall surrounded by violent offenders, completely forgotten by the world he tried to conquer. He was finally experiencing the absolute, crushing helplessness he had once forced upon me. The fate of Richard and Patricia was arguably just as poetic. My former parents had officially moved into a cramped, noisy ground-floor studio apartment on the far industrial side of the city. The bank had auctioned off their pristine suburban estate for a fraction of its value to cover the fraudulent mortgage debt they incurred. There were no more country club mixers or catered charity galas. They spent their days listening to the relentless wail of traffic and police sirens through thin, poorly insulated windows. They had to sell their designer clothes to afford basic groceries. The absolute loss of their social dignity was final and permanent. When Patricia went to the local discount grocery store, her former wealthy friends would actively turn their shopping carts down different aisles to avoid acknowledging her presence. The community treated them like toxic pariahs. They were entirely isolated. They had willingly sacrificed their own daughter and their grandson to protect an arrogant criminal, assuming their elite status would insulate them from the fallout. Instead, they lost their home, their wealth, and their entire reputation. They were left with absolutely nothing but the suffocating weight of their own spectacularly bad choices and the miserable company of each other. I pushed those dark thoughts away, letting the past remain exactly where it belonged. I walked out to the expansive back patio. The late afternoon sun was casting a brilliant golden hour glow across the manicured lawn. Miles was sprinting across the grass, laughing hysterically as Kendrick chased him with a football. My 6-year-old son was completely safe, entirely oblivious to the vicious custody battle that had threatened to tear him away from us just months ago. He was surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally, protected by a fortress of loyalty that Preston could never breach. Dominic walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We watched Nicole step out onto the patio carrying a tray of appetizers. She looked radiant and relaxed, her high-end boutique fully restored and thriving better than ever before. Kendrick jogged over, scooping Miles up and tossing him playfully over his shoulder before joining us near the outdoor fire pit. The warmth radiating from the fire matched the overwhelming sense of security wrapping around my heart. Dominic raised his glass of wine. The glowing embers of the fire caught the amber liquid as he looked at Kendrick, then at Nicole, and finally at me. He proposed a toast to the strong, fiercely resilient women who had survived the fire and rebuilt their world from the ashes. Kendrick raised his glass in agreement, his dark eyes shining with profound pride and absolute devotion. We clinked our glasses together, the crisp, clear sound ringing out across the peaceful estate. As I stood there leaning against my husband, watching my son laugh under the vast autumn sky, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I had spent my entire youth believing that family was strictly defined by shared DNA and a common last name. I had allowed toxic people to drain my resources and shatter my self-worth simply because I was desperate for their validation. But the grueling, vicious war I had just survived taught me the ultimate truth about human connection. Family is not about blood. Family is about who physically stands beside you when the entire world catches fire. It is about the people who form a shield around you when predators try to break you down. I had walked through absolute hell, confronted the monsters of my past, and dismantled their empires brick by brick. I realized then that true wealth is not measured in offshore bank accounts or luxury real estate. True wealth is the unshakable peace of mind that comes from taking your power back and realizing you never actually needed the people who tried to destroy you. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true family is never defined by shared DNA, but by unyielding loyalty during your darkest moments. For years, I chased the conditional approval of people who only valued status and wealth. When the ultimate crisis hit, my biological parents gladly traded my safety for a fraudulent mortgage. Yet in that same fire, I found my real family. People like Dominic, Nicole, and Kendrick proved that genuine love is protective, unconditional, and fiercely brave. You owe nothing to those who break you. Share how you built your chosen family and comment below.